Literally yes or no in all caps in both cases. So just one of those things you get used to. ID is actually similar in spirit to a void star pointer, which we don't talk about in 50 really. You might have seen it in CS61. A void star pointer is just a pointer that can point to anything, an int, an object, or the like. It's a way of very weakly typing some variable in C and treating it however you see fit, or coming up with very generic data structures that store pointers to void objects, anything. ID has a little more functionality built in that it's similar in spirit to a void star, that you can have an ID variable point to anything, but we'll see that it has special meaning when it comes to something called nil and being passed messages. So this is a useful object-oriented thing. Nil is like null, but we'll see that whereas in C, dereferencing null, calling a method on, or call, let's see, yeah, in C, dereferencing null generally did what? Segfault, very bad, right? So dereferencing null or garbage pointers is a very bad thing. Objective-C is much more forgiving. If you accidentally or knowingly try to call a method on a null object, now called a nil object, nothing bad will happen. It will just silently ignore the method call on it. So this is a good thing. It can still mask errors if you didn't quite intend to do that, but it can also avoid a huge number of bugs and problems in your code. So we'll see that as a feature and how to leverage that. So in terms of other data types that you don't get with Objective-C per se, but you do get with the foundation library, and recall that this library is akin to standard lib.ih, standard io.h from C, but you just get more stuff in foundation.h and its various files. You get things like ns integer, ns point, ns rect, ns size, ns unsigned integer. The only point of confusion here is that even though these things are capitalized with ns, they are not in fact objects like ns string actually is, as we saw from its documentation. These are type defs, which if you recall from C, allows you to make one word a synonym for another. And so we did this in like pset 5 and CS50 where we had a byte. Well, we actually type def that to like an unsigned char, 8 bits. Same deal here. So an ns integer is essentially an int underneath the hood, and an nsu integer is an unsigned int. This is just Apple's way of providing an abstraction layer so that in theory they could change the underlying implementation of these data types, even though in practice they're not likely to change. But just realize they're not objects. They are primitives, and it's just a syntactic potential for confusion. All right, here we go. Here comes the fun syntax. So in PHP, we don't have the notion of a header file, right? We pretty much just put everything in .php files. We can isolate classes to their own PHP files and methods and controllers and models to their own files, but there isn't this sort of dual existence of two types of files in PHP, or most languages for that, or in many languages for that matter. But in C and in Objective-C, we have it. So in Objective-C, typically, if you want to declare some class, like we did at the very start of today in PHP. If you want to declare a class in Objective-C, you put that declaration of the class in a header file, in a .h file. And the syntax you use is this: at interface, the name of the class you want to declare, in this case it's foo, colon, the name of the class that it descends from, if any. Because we're using Objective-C, it will almost always descend from NSObject or something else, so that you at least get some base functionality from the entire framework. Open curly brace, close curly brace. And inside those curly braces, as the comment here suggests, that's where you put your instance variables. Things like a student's name, things like a student's year, and any of that kind of data that you want to encapsulate inside of this object. So points of confusion here. This is a class, but it's at interface. PHP has interfaces. C++ or Java has interfaces. Objective-C has interfaces, but they're really classes. Okay, so at interface is a class. It's just different jargon for the same idea. What Objective-C calls protocols are equivalent to PHP and Java's interfaces. Okay. Just Google it when you're confused. All right, so now, and this is a bit of the syntactic messiness, when you actually want to declare the methods that are associated with this class, you actually put it outside of the curly braces, but before the symbol at end. So this is just one of the things that rubbed me the wrong way the first time. You get used to it, and everything looks beautiful eventually. But for now, just realize there isn't quite the beauty of PHP or Java that encapsulate everything that's related with big curly braces. In this case, the method declarations will actually be outside of the curly braces, but before the at end symbol. So just realize you just kind of have to get used to it. All right, and now the .m file. In the .m file, it's actually a little more straightforward. At the top of the file or thereabouts, you would say at implementation, the name of the class that you're implementing. That's it. You don't have to mention the parent class with a colon or anything like that. Then where the comment is, you put your definitions of methods, you implement them, and then at end at the very bottom. And in theory, you can put multiple classes in the same file, but generally we'll segregate things to separate files, as we've been doing for student classes and course objects and the like. All right, checkpoint. Any questions thus far? All right. So, instance variable. So what is an instance variable? Not necessarily in the context of Objective-C, but in general. What's an instance variable? Yeah?
A variable that will belong to like a specific instance of a class. So like,
perfect.
Let's say you make a new person, it will have its own name.
Perfect. So it is a variable that belongs to a specific instance, aka object of some class. So we did this in PHP earlier. We had a student class, and inside of a student class are two instance variables, name and year. And they're instance variables in the sense that you can only set those once the class actually exists. This is in contrast to something called a class variable, which is shared by all members of that class. And just to put this into that same context, if more familiar, let me go ahead and just pull up a quick text editor. So earlier when I said class student, and then I had public, we'll go back to version 1, public year. If I now did, let's say, static, actually, can I do this in PHP? Yes. Yes. All right, thank you. You were my Google. If I say static foo, in PHP, the syntax for saying that you want a class variable is to say that it's static. So it's not public or private. It's actually public by default, but static, which means that all objects that are instantiated from this class will have that same value of foo. And in fact, you don't even need to instantiate an object of type student in order to access that foo variable. So it's kind of like a class constant, but it's not necessarily constant. It can be mutated or defined by you a priori. So that's all we mean by that. So instance variables are essentially the types of variables we've been talking about all this time. Just as in PHP, you can specify things like private and public or protected, where they generally mean what's familiar to you, and protected is essentially somewhere in between public and private. But we'll see these more over time. So class method. What is a class method? Well, just like a class variable is one that exists inside of a class, even if you've not instantiated any objects. And when you do, it's shared by all of those objects of that class. A class method is one that you can call on a class without having to instantiate an object in advance. You can just call it. So you can think of a constructor as effectively being a class method in the context of, say, PHP, or some other languages, where you can call it explicitly before you before you have an object of a class. So the plus is what makes a method a class method. You can call it before you've instantiated an object. So here's how we might use this. Here's a snippet of code, one line, that specifies how I can declare a pointer to an object of type student. All of that should be familiar from the world of C on the left-hand side. Pointer is called student, class is student, pointer is indicated by the star. On the equal sign, now we have some new Objective-C syntax. So in PHP, recall that you can call methods like s and then arrow foo, open paren, close paren, and that's how you invoke a method called foo on an object called s. Well, in Objective-C, the syntax essentially becomes this, whereby you have open brace, close brace, s space foo on the inside. And the jargon to use here is that you're not really calling the method foo on the object s in Objective-C. You're passing the foo message to the object s. And it's sort of a subtle distinction. It's more important over time, especially in the context of nil, but these are effectively equivalent. So this is the first thing you sort of get used to. For those familiar with Lisp or Scheme, realize that these are our parentheses, but that language is much worse with its syntax. All right, so passing a message. Now, instance methods. These are methods that, conversely, can only be called when an object of some class actually exists. So this is how I might declare some instance methods. And the very top, and you'll see things differently stylistically. Apple typically has the minus sign, space, then in parentheses, the return value of the method, then no space, then the name of the method, and then semicolon. Since we're just declaring the methods here, we're not actually implementing them. So on the top there, we have an example of effectively a getter. So instead of calling it getAge, it's just called age in this case. And then we have a method called setAge, and it takes an argument of type int, whose name is, the name of that argument is age. At the bottom, these aren't constructors per se. In Objective-C, the notion of a constructor is effectively broken up into two pieces. The alloc method, which you can think of as similar in spirit to malloc from the world of C, and then an initialization method. And this is not a language requirement, but it's a human convention. Almost always, when you initialize an object in Objective-C, you will call some method whose name begins with the word int.